So continuing on with the how to write a great how-to blog post. Today is going to be all about prerequisites, how not to lose your reader before you even start. So let's begin. All right, so here's a simple outline. And first up, I'm going to start with an example. I'm going to pretend like this presentation is a blog post. So let's say, oh, here we go. Let's do this. So let's say the title is, I don't know, how to install and configure Acme app. Could be anything. And let's pretend Acme app is only available on Linux. So let's say that I'm writing a blog post and it's only available on Linux. Bad intro. Let's get started. Open your bash terminal and keep going. This is just the very first step of the tutorial after what would be a prereq. So I've started out with example because the first thing you see here, if you may not notice that it automatically references something that you should have, bash. It's assuming that your reader has a bash terminal installed. Well, what if they're on Windows? What if they're on, I don't know, Mac OS? Maybe they don't even have bash installed or some other kind of crazy operating system or something. That's a bad intro. You assume these things. Two, versus the good intro. Before we get too far, this tutorial includes some hands-on demos to ensure you can follow along, ensure that you're on a Linux computer. So simple prerequisites. Make sure that you don't assume anything, and you specify everything that they're going to possibly have up front. All right, so I'm going to break that concept down a little bit into each individual piece that I've kind of figured out here. So first up, automatically, if you were here in the first one, if you've seen that first presentation I did, who's the reader? It all comes back to the reader again, the personas. What would a typical tech pro know and already have? Start one level up. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you think about how the reader is coming in. I talked about this quite a bit with reader personas and searcher intent or reader intent in that previous presentation I did. But essentially what you want to do is define who we make some assumptions that we have to make some assumptions. So you can make an assumption with a typical ATA reader is that they are going to be, an IT professional, sysadmin, DevOps pro guy, cloud engineer, those kind of people. They're not going to be, a dentist or a doctor or a gardener or anything like that. So we know the specific kind of niche that the blog has. So once we know that, then we start one level up. So for an example with that is, what would you assume a tech pro knows? So you can assume that, they know how to open a web page. They know how to, probably open up PowerShell, open up a command line. They know how to open up programs in Windows. And so from there, you don't mention all that stuff that you would natively assume. You start one level up. So in this instance, let's say that you're going to say, well, you can't even guess what operating system are you. They're going to say, you assume that, they know how to open a program. So instead of saying, in the prereqs, you would say, you need bash, or you need Acme app, or you need some kind of application. You can't assume that that application is going to be on every one of your readers' computers. Anything that you can't logically say, you can't think to yourself, well, that's not, even if you're, let's say that you're writing a blog post on something on Windows. You put a blog post that requires, I don't know, some Windows app. You can assume that they're on Windows with the prereq, but then you start one level up. So anything that's installed on Windows by default, you don't really have to say that. You just say you need Windows, and you can just assume that we did this a little bit with PowerShell, to where when we were saying Windows 10, Windows PowerShell 5.1. You don't really have to say both of those, because Windows PowerShell 5.1 always comes on Windows 10. So essentially, it's kind of that layers. You got the operating system layer that you could maybe assume everything, and then you have the next layer up, an application, some kind of specific configuration. That's what I need in there. And it makes the low level assumption. So what's a typical tech pro? What's every tech pro that you could ever imagine going to have? Like the knowledge that they're going to have, the operating system that they may that they may be running, just their general overall expertise, and maybe what they have, their configuration. So go for the very generic. And then finally, just, know your reader. It all comes back to knowing who your reader is, where they are starting from. It's all about personas. All right, so there are a lot of different ways to create these kind of prereqs. Different companies have different suggestions on how to create the prereqs and what the prereqs mean. For an ATA blog post, I've kind of broken it down into 3 different purposes. So the first one is to bring the reader's environment in line with yours. That is the majority of the prerequisites out there that you'll see on training courses, on technical how-to blog posts, on generally anything how-to. It's to bring up the reader's environment in line with yours. So an application. So if you're going to tell somebody to demonstrate how to use, I don't know, let's just say, gosh, I'm terrible at thinking random things. Let's just say that that WinDiff utility. So some WinDiff utility, that utility isn't installed by default on Windows. So you're going to say you need this utility installed. You need to build the baseline. You need to say you need this Azure resource in place. You need this Azure VM. You need this EC2, and you need this AWS IAM user configuration this way. So it's all about bringing the reader's environment in line. You always want the reader to start at the very same spot that you have started at. The next one is to help the reader understand attributes specific to environment. I'm going to go down through examples of each of these in these other sections here, but the second one is to help the reader understand attributes specific to your environment. For example, if you are demonstrating something in Active Directory, then you're going to, while you're doing that, your screenshots, your instructions, you're going to have references to like the Active Directory domain name in here. So in the prerequisites, when you say you need an Active Directory domain name, it's better to just say you have the Active Directory domain name. This tutorial is using, X domain name. So it gives the readers a good reference to what you are writing about. And then third, the next one is to make it clear in the future your instructions may not work as expected. This typically is not used for prereqs, but I really like this because this involves telling the version. So if you are demonstrating a version of a particular piece of software, all the steps that you're doing in that particular version 1.0, by the time somebody comes along, maybe 3 years from now, it's going to be at version 4.0, and it could be that all your steps don't make sense whatsoever. It's good to keep to tell exactly the versions that you're using up front to just say, let them read down through just the prerequisites. And then at that time, they'll just kind of go off, oh, this is only a version 1. This is old. I don't need to mess with this. Instead of having them go down through each and every one of your sections, and then by the 3/4 of the way, this thing's broke, this thing's broke, and they just end up all pissed off and they just leave the blog. It's better to kind of leave those assumptions up front. So I'm going to kind of explain each of these with some good examples now. So first up, assumption levels and dependencies. This is a good one. A domain joined Windows 10 PC. This is a good example of an assumption level. You're assuming that they have a domain joined Windows 10 PC is a dependency. And I've kind of broken this down a little bit by 2 different levels, kind of what I saw here, what I mentioned up here about personas. So whenever you define a prereq, level 1, the first question you ask yourself, what would a typical tech pro, may have? Here I provided some text to kind of give you an example. We don't have to tell, the reader how to buy a new computer, install an operating system, click a mouse, start a web browser, just to tell them to go to google.com. That's a good example of, there is that one web page that showed, I forget what that web page is called, but it showed like every single piece of tasks that must happen before your computer will even go to google.com. You got your DNS request, you've got your networking, you've got keyboard, you got all kinds of things going on. It's important to not to cover all that. You have to assume some way to the level. And then the second level here, I just have a level 2. That's all the stuff your reader needs to follow along with you. You can assume that they have a computer, they're on an operating system, then I'm going to click a mouse, start a web browser. You assume all that stuff what a tech pro knows how to do. At this point, you have level 2. This is where the prerequisites come in. Not everyone's going to have what I call a dependent service, like a specific version of a piece of software, a specific environment configuration, everything that doesn't come by default from the manufacturer of the product, the cloud, whatever. Anything that's not default, that is where you should start at your prerequisites. So assume level 1, define level 2. Assume to a general degree would it have a configuration that a tech pro would have, and then at level 2, then define exactly what they need. And you go, every reader starts from somewhere different. That's very important to remember. You're not writing for yourself. You're writing for, there is almost 470 something thousand readers a month now on the blog. You're writing for hundreds of thousands of readers potentially. So you need to start out with a generic base, a very generic, try to hit as many of those readers as you possibly can. All right, another one. Prerequisites give context. This tutorial will be using a domain called lab.local. This doesn't give you you're not assuming anything, you're telling them something. You're telling them that the post, the post, you'll see some references to lab.local in a post. So you define tutorial specific attributes right away. The tutorial will be using a domain called lab.local. We'll be creating, the tutorial will create a user called ABC Joe user. We'll be, creating a version. Well, I'll talk about the version in a minute, but essentially you're defining all those specific attributes that the reader will probably not have to give them a way to notice that, to reference that as they're going down through. I'll try to find a blog post that shows this, but as I'm talking through it, I don't know if it's going to make complete sense or not, but essentially it's just providing the context to the user. It's saying, we're going to be using this domain called lab.local. And then in your screenshots, you're going to have references to lab.local. You're going to maybe say in your instruction, now go to the lab.local domain or something. When you say that, it's not going to confuse them because they've seen already up in the prerequisites, you'll see all the tutorials using that. That way you don't have to constantly be saying, insert your, domain name here, insert your domain name here, all these things. You can just use the configuration that, or the attributes in your specific environment, and telling them that those are the attributes that they're using in the prereqs. All right, and let's see here. Here's another one. Take time into account. The tutorial will be using version 1.3. Versions are very important when you take time into account. Just like I said before, the tutorial, you may be using 1.3 of this software, and a blog post could be up for years, could be up for 5 years or something, and by that time it could be at version 5, and the instructions that you give could be completely different. Your post is just a single point in time capture. You have to remember that. You have to, that's the good thing about the prerequisites. You say, this tutorial requires, I don't know, version 1 plus or something, and is using version 1.3. You set that very clear up front, exactly what they're going to be using up front. And, like I said, tech evolves fast. It could be 6 months from now, your post could be out of date. In a perfect world, we go back and update all the posts, but there's like 400 something posts out there now, and we're going to have to deal with that at some point. But for now, don't irritate the crap out of them 3/4 of the way when everything's breaking, when you know up front that you use this specific version. Give them a specific version that you use to give them the decision if they want to continue reading the post or not. All right, here we go. Preventing knowledge dead ends. So this is a same exact text as the one before, but now notice there is one difference. Here's version 1.3 of Acme software. You see there's a link here. It's linked. This is one thing that that you should do throughout the blog post. Whenever a reader comes to the blog post, you want to be their guide. You have essentially failed at your mission at helping them solve a problem, learn a skill, whatever they're going to do, if they have to click back and go try to look for something else in Google and try to find some other source of information. Essentially, that is your baseline. That's how you define success or failure to blog post. If they have to go back and search for another blog post or something else that has the same thing, you failed at your mission at helping them. So to not fail, but to give them some kind of guide. There's some people that in this instance are not going to have version 1.3. They're going to see this and be like, oh, I'm at, I don't know, version 0.5 of Acme software. And if you failed at your mission, then they have to go back, do a search for version 1 Acme software, version 1.5, find the link for it, download it, and figure out how to download it, install it, and then they have to come back. What your mission is to be the guide. You want to help them even if your blog post can't help them out at all, you need to at least guide them somewhere that they can. You always provide some kind of link off to somewhere else that can help them. So let's say that they're interested in reading this blog post that shows up version 1.3. They don't have it. Instead of them having to go back, find the link themselves, figure out how to do it, you would link to the download page, exact download page of version 1.3, and preferably a download page and install page that shows them how to install this. That guides them along in exactly what they need to do. You're providing the link. You're preventing them from having to go back. So you're preventing a lot of hassle for them. 10, don't make your reader Google again. That's what it is. Just, you need to either answer their question, solve their problem, give them a skill, whatever the mission of the blog post is. Don't make them go somewhere else to look for the information. Even if you can't, it's just not in scope what you're going to teach, at least give them a link off somewhere else for them to go. Just be the guide, just guide them along. Don't just say stop and just nothing, and then they have to just go back on their own. Really help them out. And here we go. If you can't help them, tell them who can. That's what it's all about. If they come to you, we do our best at defining scope with the title and the meta description and all that good stuff. If they come to the post and they're coming for some reason it's really not in the scope of your article, then you can't help them. But at least tell them who can. Link off to some other authoritative website in the prereqs. All right, here is a good example. This is a common question that I get. Demonstrate or just create a prereq. This goes back to the example of, I don't know, let's just say, this is good. When do I create a prereq versus when do I demonstrate how to fulfill the prereq? That goes back to scope. It all goes back to scope. So let's say that you are demonstrating an article, some kind of post on, I don't know, I always go back to software. Let's say you're installing XYZ software. You're not going to say, in the instruction, you're not going to say, first, install your operating system. Second, now go to your browser and do this. Third, do this. You're not going to explain all that stuff because it's not in scope. Scope is really important. You define scope. We went over scope, I think, in one of the previous presentations about intent. Scope is doing exactly what the title says and what the description says and no more. You're not boiling the ocean in your post. You have to set a baseline first, and then once the baseline is set, then describe everything you're going to hear. That's how you would decide whether to demonstrate something, show how to do something, or just define a prereq. That prereq sets the foundation where you're starting to set instruction from, and it all comes down to scope. And this is a good question that you ask yourself if you think, well, should I demonstrate this thing or should I create a prereq? Can it be used in other contexts? Let's take a good example. Let's say that you are provisioning something in AWS, and to do that, you're going to need a user account, some kind of permission to provision that thing in AWS. You're going to need like an IAM user, some kind of user account. That user account is used to authenticate, every one of the AWS services out there. You need a user account to provision an EC2 instance. You need a user account to create a Lambda. You need IAM user account to do lots of different things. That the act of creating that that user account can be used in all kinds of different contexts. That's a good indication that it needs to be a prereq, and you do not need to demonstrate that thing, because at some point we've done this a little bit on the blog. We can create kind of a hierarchy of blog posts where you have, one blog post is about how to create a user account in AWS. And then that can then be linked to from many other ones. So let's say that you have how to create an EC2 instance or something in AWS. And the prereq is to create an IAM user. Typically, we would just link off to somewhere else how to create an IAM user. If we have our own content about how to create an IAM user, it can then link off to, we can have multiple posts linking off of that one. So that's a good example of a prereq. Can it be used across many different types of situations? And then finally, I had here, will the knowledge gained help the reader understand your subject? If your scope is how to create an AWS EC2 instance, if you go off on a tangent down a rabbit hole and tell them how to create an IAM user, here's how you do this specific little policy thing when you're creating this user, here's how you do all these little things that it has nothing to do with creating an EC2 instance. That knowledge gain, they do gain some knowledge, but it's completely ancillary to what the scope is. The more specific thing to think about here is understand your subject. Does it help the reader understand your subject, the scope of the article, not just, understand something? That's another good question to ask if you're ever wondering, what's a prerequisite or what should I, show the reader. And finally, the template here, I just created a little template. This is in, there's an example of the prereqs in all of the how-to post templates, but essentially this is kind of how I have figured out a way to kind of incorporate everything in there. So the prereq should be fairly straightforward to everyone. That's kind of like the prereq are pretty much standardized when it comes to ATA blog posts, other than the body and all that stuff. The prereq should have the first thing here. This article will be a hands-on tutorial, because some articles, they may see it and they may not know you're actually going to walk through things. It's a hands-on tutorial. You're going to keys on the keyboard, your fingers on the keyboard are going to have to actually do something. If you'd like to follow along, I always just added this in here, something like this, to think, well, some people are just going to read through it and just say, oh, that's interesting, I'll try that later. But some people are actually going to go through each and every step that you're doing and follow along. That's why I put, if you'd like to follow along, be sure you have the following. You don't want to insinuate like, well, before you even read this blog post, you need all these things. Obviously you don't need all this stuff, but to fully understand and comprehend all the instructions that you're going to provide, then you need to have this. And then here I have, operating system X, Y. This is all a bulleted list. I like the bulleted list because it's easy to differentiate the one from the other. This should kind of be thought of as like a checklist. Check, I've got this one. Check, I've got this one. Check, I've got this one. That way it's not just a paragraph, it's a bulleted list for them to be able to easily check this off, check it off, instead of having to, read down through a list. So this is the few of the examples that I had, an operating system version, a software version, or some kind of dependent service. And here's where I'm adding in, the context and the time into account. This tutorial will use Windows 10 build, blah, blah, blah. That goes back to the time thing. They may be running Windows 10 build 5000 or whatever it is at the time. Anything that's pertinent to your instruction, but any version of Windows 7 should work fine. You can say this. I usually don't like to say the should thing because it's relative, but if you think, for the most part, it's probably all going to work for you. If you say should fine, you're telling them that, I'm pretty certain, but we're not completely 100% certain. And then software Y, I always put in here, this tutorial will use version, X.X, and this should probably be a link here. Always go back to what is the specific version that the software is going to be. And then finally, a dependent service or some kind of configuration. Here's a good example. This tutorial uses an Azure or an Ubuntu Linux Azure virtual machine. If you're showing how to configure something that specifically has to be an Ubuntu Azure virtual machine, you are assuming that they have that. Start from that very foundation. Here's the next important one. The demos in this tutorial, whatever, will use a VM called ABC. That's important there because you're going to have references to ABC in like your screenshots. And it's a good thing for them to see in the screenshots or in the instruction. Oh, up here. Okay, I see. I forgot. In the prereqs, he said that they were going to use that VM called ABC. That gives them some context to look for. But that's all I had. This is I don't know, fairly short one again. So feel free. Anybody have anything, questions, anything related to prereqs or writing in general or anything like that? The floor is open.
No, but I'll say that was a good explanation. I like the thought process between kind of saying why you're doing all the versioning and why you're linking. That definitely helps.
Yeah, good. It took me a while to figure out. It took me a while to think about why the hell am I even recommending this. Then I thought, like, okay, this made me go through a good thought exercise on myself to telling why. It's all about instruction. I just know what I tweeted yesterday. You can't really teach the how until you know the why and can teach that. So I think that's really important.
And I like the near the end when you had the template. I think that is very useful for a bunch of examples because those are pretty common to most of the articles that we have, which is do this, do that. This is an operating system. This is an application. So it's fairly common, that pattern.
Yeah, that
won't always be the case.
At least the format, yeah. You can just pretty much copy this.
Yeah,
just
for
copy
most
and paste and everything. Yeah.
And I think that will help, writers when they're going through this be like, well, if we have this library of examples, obviously you can't, you have to customize for whatever you're doing. But prereqs are one of those things where that should cover most.
Yeah, I think so. They're definitely the simplest to use with. They're still pretty. I mean, they're pretty important. We need them in each post. Obviously, you don't want to just start from now start this. Everything about a good how-to blog post is not assuming anything. Try to just be as clear as possible.
I think feedback you gave me on one of my prereqs, because I mentioned something like, some PowerShell knowledge, and you're like, that's not a prereq. And I think I was like, okay, you just maybe assume that.
Yeah, I mean,
they could follow along or something.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like knowledge, like you can do that. I know some places do that, like Pluralsight courses. They say like you need this level of knowledge and this. I don't know. You can get crazy with that. I don't normally put as a prereq. You need to learn this, but simply because the rest of the blog posts, if written well, is very clear and exactly what they need to do, and it kind of teaches what they need to know as they go along. So that's why I typically don't say you need to know PowerShell, because if we write the post right, hopefully they'll kind of get it as they go along.
Now, I could see one place where that might be more applicable is if you have a really complex subject, and the thing that immediately comes to mind is, say, machine learning. If there is such a complexity in some of that there might be a base level of knowledge if we're starting to do those kind of things that make sense, that you might have to assume a certain level of knowledge, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think for the most part, it's kind of a gray subject, but I mean, the way I think about it is the majority of the posts that we do are not going to get way in the weeds, because they're naturally not going to get that way, because they're going to be like such niche things, and usually very niche topics are not going to be, there's not going to be a lot of people that are going to be wanting to search for it. Know that anyway. And all the blog posts we have are generally meant for, the masses, like try to get as many people as we can that are looking for this sort of thing. So if you say like how to write a PowerShell script to query Active Directory and write to this registry key and do all, and you get really niche, those are probably not going to be an ATA blog post anyway. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and most of our stuff is very actionable.
Yeah.
So, it's not a lot of theoretical. And I mean, and that's a common thing that everyone does, myself included, which is like you want to kind of explain all this stuff, but a lot of times folks are coming to the blog because they want to do something. They don't
Yeah, that's
want
what
all
I mean.
that.
That's what I try to really focus on. Just if you want to do something, come to ATA and learn how to do it. You're not going to just have to read some marketing propaganda that goes over here's why you should do this, and it doesn't actually demonstrate whatever you're doing. I hate those kind of posts. Those
Well, and
kind of thought leadership posts.
exactly. And what you said before, which is, hey, you've got, you take everything you would have written up here, all of that content of explaining that, and then put it in as you're going, the call outs, the little bits that you can probably get away with saying almost all of it in line as you're
Yeah,
talking about the
yeah,
action.
by far and away. If you've got like 4 or 5 paragraphs up front, they're just going to immediately skip by that if you're going to do it. I mean, if there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of people like myself that they want to just get down to it and start getting their hands dirty on something. And the quickest way to do that is get started immediately, but don't leave the 2 or 3 paragraphs or whatever it is up front. You can always incorporate that, that teaching as they go along. I agree.
And I will say that there is one, I think that's the fuzziest spot I've seen for a lot of folks, which is sometimes you do need 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain some of it before you jump in. But at what point and at what line is it? And that's a hard thing to figure out. And I think it goes back a little bit to that persona,
Everything goes
who's
back to
coming
that.
in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Everything. There's a good example of, and also goes back to the title. So there was one example. What was that? What was that example today? It was, here we go. MBT stat. So old utility, but not everyone is probably going to know what NBT stat is. And even the title is, it's not how to use the NBT stat. It's wrangling NetBIOS with the NBT stat utility. It's like the title doesn't explicitly say how to do this thing with NBT stat. It's wrangling NetBIOS. It's more of a general kind of concept. And I think when you have a kind of a general title like getting started with NBT stat or whatever, that kind of insinuates that there needs to be a little bit more of the kind of the understanding stuff, the getting them used to what NBT stat is and all that sort of thing.